it is a very abusive, pattern of conversation. It's very aggressive. They're very dominant. They're very reductive. They belittle, invalidate, take away. So when we're talking about the dogmatic scientific principles, I'm going to look at the DOTS system as a way for explaining this. So the DOTS system, dopamine, estrogen, testosterone and serotonin. This is the work of Helen Fisher. She is a scientist who has discovered that there are 4 primary brain systems. There are 4 systems of operations within the brain that rely or stem from these 4 primary hormones, drivers, and that dopamine, estrogen, testosterone and serotonin, we all have them in our system. We all have them to a certain extent, and we all have a primary and a secondary. So, your primary, while we all have all 4, you might be really high in serotonin, your primary, and then you might have a secondary of estrogen. And that constructs, kind of 40 to 60% of the personality. The personality, how you are in the world, how you interact in the world, how you see the world, the filter of your mind and how it's going to take observations in, how it's going to filter through importance, the layer of information that a particular brain or a person is going to prioritize. So somebody who is high in serotonin and then estrogen is going to have a very different view and mentality in the world than somebody who's high in testosterone and then has dopamine. This is how we are formed. It's who we are. And in having these alternative or newer ways of looking at things, it really just helps pepper out the picture. So certainly my take on it is that the dogmatic scientific brain or mind of an individual is sort of the personification of the testosterone system. So all of these are personality types, and there's a cluster of personality traits that manifest within these different systems, these different brain systems, internal wiring systems. I talk about the DOT system a lot, or I'm going to, so I am going to have a video overviewing that and overviewing basically the research of Helen Fisher and bringing it to a use value when it comes to this model of the going dotty system. So people who are high in testosterone, it's all about testosterone. Brain is all about rules. It's all about structure. It's all about logic. It's all about being linear. It's factual, data, information. They like things that are verifiable. They like proof. They're very high on hierarchy and dominance and rules. So if you have an airy-fairy spiritual person who is talking to somebody with a testosterone brain, whose frame of reference of the world is, science, facts, what is very structured, rules, linear, A and B must have a clear, simple path that they already understand. If it's verifiable, if there have been studies, if there is proof of these sorts of things, and where does this airy-fairy person sit within the hierarchical scheme? Do I need to respect them? And can I be more dominant over and above them because of our different places? What I think we can find with the scientism and the culture of scientism that exists in the world today, which again was highlighted through something I watched by Lisa Miller. Lisa Miller is a neuroscientist who was doing research and discovery in an area, and what she found is that a lot of her fellow scientists were very closed off. They were very myopic. They were very much no. And she was very much discounted from this, and therefore that explained to me the culture of scientism that I've come up against quite a lot. But again, I'll go through the profile of the sort of individual who tends to take issue with my sort of work. And when I'm in these sorts of conversations, because they're very dominant, it's very aggressive, when you have somebody really ripping the words, really ripping the words from your throat and saying, you can't say this, that is wrong, you are incorrect. And I think what really happens here is somebody who's very high in testosterone and has a very much testosterone brain, where their worldview and their inner landscape is already set to these principles, and they don't really allow for much dexterity either, there's nobody who follows science or respects science to any sort of degree that can't allow for the basic laws in physics of physics, on the material plane. It has one set of rules. But then when you go into the quantum field, it's a very different set of rules, and they contradict each other a lot. They don't really seem to operate in a logical, linear manner. But if you're talking to somebody with this dogmatic scientism, then they just completely discount that. It's almost like when it suits them, they close their ear off to what is a reasonable, logical suggestion, because they can't follow the road, they can't bridge the gap from point A to point B, because it's not already set in their system. And this is the difficulty. We're essentially discussing here like a closed mental construct. But this closed mental construct of scientism is a very predominant leading force in the world at this time. It's what's making our decisions. And I'm not saying that that's necessarily a bad thing. I'm just stating it for what it is and trying to highlight it, and saying that it's very counterproductive to somebody within my field who finds that I'm not allowed, speak freely or get into the structure of things, because what you find is that people will just, squash it straight away. And there's a very loud voice for all of that in the world. It's very easy to undercut or invalidate a lot of this sort of work when you have all of these facts that have been built up over generations and like a couple of hundred years of scientific development. And this kind of is what brings us into the next area of it, is that when you study science, the history of science, and how science itself has grown and evolved. And a wonderful overview for all of this is Bill Bryson's A Short History of Nearly Everything. It's essentially a historical overview of the history of science, how it has developed. You see a lot of the limitations of this scientism and the dogma of science, because, a couple of hundred years ago, the belief was that, the world was maybe 5 or 10 million years old, or however long it was. 100 years ago, just over 100 years ago, the concept that you could measure the weather, that the weather was a measurable thing, this was outside the remit of the consciousness of people at that time, and yet we know that it's true. So there's this concept that science knows everything, but it doesn't really. It knows a lot and has a lot of value, but there's this other layer of life. There's this other side to the experience of being here, and it would be very useful if we could overlay one with the other, as opposed to having them as completely separate. The other element to just point out at this time is there is a book called Creativity by a guy called Mihai, and a surname that I certainly can't pronounce, but I'll pop it up on the screen. And this was a psychologist from an Ivy League university over in America who studied creative people who were really at the fore of the creative industry. And what you find with scientists who are really at the leading edge of discovery is that they have both sides of the brain. They have the linear, logical testosterone system, rules, structure, proofs, measurement specifically. But they also have this openness, this questioning, this wonder, this almost element of spiritual experience. And again, because of the work of Helen Fisher, we know that spirituality or religiosity comes from a high level of serotonin. And we know from Lisa Miller's work that this is actually stimulated in a very particular part of the brain. So there's a lot of new elements that are coming into the equation that are making things make sense now. But it's also about putting these things together in a certain way and manner and allowing it to come out in a new perspective and a new point of view. To finish off that point about people who have a very strong testosterone brain and system, I've really struggled with it quite a lot in my own life because it's caused me quite a lot of heartache. It's also been, quite frankly, rather abusive over the years, and something I've had to build within myself to be able to deal and integrate with that. But what I find about people who are very strong within their testosterone system is that, first of all, they have to be open to being able to absorb another conceptual way of looking at life. Science, the measurement of things, it's very factual. It's not you're training your conceptual brain to see things through a certain formula or to filter information in a certain way. But what happens if you have to take on a philosophical truth? Just as an example, these two systems don't necessarily go well together. So the first thing that I find about the testosterone mind is that the first ingredient that a person needs is to be able to take on larger concepts of a philosophical or sort of spiritual sort of nature. And then the other element is there is a certain sort of innate human intelligence that is required to be able to grasp these concepts, you know. Now, I'm not saying that people who are dogmatically held to the remit and principles of rigid science, it's not that they don't have intelligence or that they aren't intelligent. It's the type of intelligence. It's how they can use, morph and mold that intelligence. There's somewhere between 7 and 9 different types of intelligence. Musical intelligence is one, interpersonal, intrapersonal, communicative, language, linguistic skills, you know, numbers, maths and science. Science is only one of the intelligences. There are others. And if we allow, you know, the measurement of everything to be the only intelligence, that's a real limitation, you know. So what I've also found is that people who are very dogmatically against this kind of way of looking at life, they just don't seem to have access to these planes of conceptual consideration. You know, they're not tapped into that part of their psyche. That part of themselves isn't active or not available. You know, it still obviously happens and operates within humanity because it's a thing. But then there is the question of, if somebody can't access this part of themselves, how much of that is their responsibility? If you don't have access to something, you don't have access to it. If you can only see a certain proportion of the equation, you know, that's not necessarily your responsibility to be able to get the other proportion of the equation, but to certainly have a certain amount of humility to say, well, this is it within my remit as being understandable. That would really go a long way, because that's context. You know, this is my opinion within this context, therefore it's only this valid. That goes for somebody from a spiritual observational platform as much as it comes from somebody from a scientific observational platform. We want to ideally move away from dogma, move away from there's only one truth and this is what it is. You know, everything is much more complex than that. So finally, to try and give maybe a little bit of context, I want to just share a little bit of a profile of the sorts of individuals that I have experienced this from again and again. You know, again, maybe I wouldn't have used this language at the time, but very dominant, like very, quite frankly, very abusive. But in a social construct, it's deemed to be acceptable because this scientific way of looking at things is respected within society. So if you have somebody who's very scientifically minded, who is undercutting somebody who is very spiritually minded, that is seen as an acceptable conversation. Now, at this stage in life, I would just save my energy, save my breath, and I wouldn't really engage with it. But again, this was something that happened in the past. It's something I do come up against quite a lot, and how I deal with it now is very different with how I dealt with it before. But there are kind of common factors and principles in the kind of profile of the individual that would seriously take an awful lot of aggressive issues with this sort of work. So they've always been male. They've always, in fairness, been able to acknowledge that they have emotional difficulties in some way, shape or form. Either they're not very emotional, they resist their emotions, or they repress their emotions. They've always been very aggressive. They've always felt like they own the words. You know, they specifically don't allow for certain words to be used outside of the context that they allow for it. So, for example, the word geometry has a mathematical meaning, but it also has different inflections. One of the definitions of geometry is the relationship between parts. So we can talk about the geometry of a spider's web, the shape and the pattern that it makes. But if you're trying to talk about geometry, you know, and sacred geometry with somebody with this kind of dogmatic scientific principle, they'll just say, you can't say that, you don't know what you're talking about. And they just shut off the conversation, you know. So this is really what this video is addressing, these very real world applications and spaces. What I've also found about people who fit this profile is they'll be educated, they'll often have gone to university, but they'll never have researched or specialised in a topic. So people who have a degree, they'll never have a master's or a PhD. What I find with people who are scientifically minded and have at least a master's, if not a PhD, is they also usually have a certain amount of openness to be able to understand the field and the research that has gone into this work on a certain level of, I suppose really it's just respect. You know, they mightn't agree with it and they might push back on certain points or they might highlight certain things, but it's almost like you educate people to a certain degree and they become arrogant, but when they haven't actually researched or specialised in anything, they take that education in an arrogant manner as opposed to having an appreciation of like research and having a textured view of different fields. So if you have a PhD student, you know, in some scientific discipline, they are going to have a certain amount of respect for a master's student within a philosophical discipline. That doesn't mean that the scientist believes or agrees with the philosopher, but can at least acknowledge it on a certain level without invalidating it, without discounting it. And that's really a key distinction as well. And also what you find is they're very negative. You know, they like to take things away. There's a lot of gaslighting. There's a lot of invalidation. It is a very abusive, you know, pattern of conversation. It's very aggressive. They're very dominant. They're very reductive. They belittle, invalidate, take away. And they really don't seem to have the sort of openness that is needed or required to take on board the fullness of these sorts of systems. So this video today is a little bit of a hurdle that I've had to get over, insofar as in order for me to have a framework in the future for future videos, this is a topic that I feel that I need to address, a basis that I can fall back on where I have covered off, you know, key difficulties or points. It's been, I suppose, a little bit of my own experience as well, things that have happened, things that you're likely to come across if you take on the spiritual view or the spiritual mentality and understanding. There is going to be a certain sort of model and brain system in our current society that's going to resist and repress that to a certain extent. So hopefully by expressing this in the way that I have, it offers some tools for you to be able to combat that within yourself, understanding that there are two separate things as opposed to everything having to be operating within singularity, which is something that happens a lot in a third dimensional conscious construct. And again, that's a buzzword, you know, third dimensional conscious construct. You can't say that, it doesn't mean anything. Well, it doesn't mean anything within science yet, but it certainly means an awful lot within the conceptual energetic system and spirituality at this point in time. I think it's important to be honest, open, be upfront and to disclose some of the problems, issues and difficulties that we have in these sorts of situations. And I think there's a big new layer of grassroots that is being embedded into the spiritual culture at this time. The spiritual scene has been the way that it's been for the last decade and it hasn't really changed very much. It's all gone towards a certain trajectory. And I think what we're finding now is that that system and structure is collapsing a little bit and there's a new grassroots element coming out. And this sort of covering off this topic is certainly a part of that to my mind. Thank you very much for joining me today. I really appreciate your time. Let me know if there's any concepts or issues or problems or questions that you have from this particular video, and I'll do my best to cover them off as best I can. I'll talk to you again and look after yourselves.